Thank you. Thanks, Frank, and thanks everyone for being here. The hour's a bit late, so I'll just rip through this as fast as I can. So let's actually start with some good news for a change. Unmanned aerial vehicles, commonly referred to as drones, are providing tremendous advantages to our military as it hunts for terrorists overseas. Drones can monitor targets for extended periods of time and strike with tremendous precision, posing minimal risk to civilians on the ground and zero risk to American pilots. There's no denying that drones have given our military important options in the counterterrorism space and are also on trajectory to give us more options in the military-to-military environment with perhaps even greater autonomy than what we're seeing now. On the domestic side, drones are providing benefits for law enforcement and public safety and have additional potential down the road for government in these areas. They can also potentially give the private sector the capability to monitor its own critical infrastructure. In the commercial space domestically, drones are technologically capable of transforming all sorts of industries, agriculture, real estate, product delivery, etc. Now the bad news. You don't have to be one of the good guys to acquire drone technology. Hostile nation states, as well as non-state actors such as terrorist organizations and drug cartels, are getting their hands on drones as well. To be sure, they do not have what we have in terms of the level of sophistication of our drones or the infrastructure that supports them. But they don't need to have exactly what we have in order to accomplish their objectives and cause problems for us. Next slide. In general, the drone industry is growing globally. Right now, according to the Teal Group, the world is spending $6.4 billion every year on developing drone technology. That number is expected to double to $11.5 billion annually by 2024, with most of it going toward military applications. RAND previously observed that 70 countries already have various kinds of drones, armed and/or unarmed. And that was even before the Obama administration made its recent announcement about drone exports, but I'll come to that in just a second. Next slide. Where does the U.S. fit in? The U.S. is projected to remain the largest user of drones in the near term, comprising 45% of the global market, with half of U.S. demand coming from the Air Force. And then you have the big announcement that the administration made last month that the U.S. is going to ramp up the export of drones, armed and unarmed, worldwide. Now, prior to 2015, we had sold armed drones only to the United Kingdom and unarmed surveillance drones to NATO allies like France and Italy. With this announcement, we're opening up the possibility of more sales on a case-by-case basis under certain conditions. First, because we're a party to a non-binding arrangement, not a treaty, called the Missile Technology Control Regime, or the MTCR, we have committed to approaching requests for our armed drones with a, quote, strong presumption of denial, meaning if a country comes to us asking to buy our drones, if they have a range of more than 300 kilometers and can carry a payload greater than 500 kilograms, we force that country to make a strong case for why they should have those drones, and then we only export in, quote, rare circumstances. On top of that, we're going to require that potential recipients of our drone exports commit to certain principles, comply with international law on the use of force and human rights, don't use them for unlawful force or surveillance of your own domestic population. And finally, potential drone recipients also have to give end-use assurances and possibly agree to end-use monitoring from us. Next slide. That's where the U.S. fits into the picture today. And as for our allies, as of today, Israel is still in the lead as the world's largest exporter of drones. Other allied nations are working on developing their own, the UK, France, Colombia, India, and South Korea among them. Next slide. But as I said at the outset, you don't have to be a good guy to get your hands on drones. So the question is, what are these guys up to? Next slide. Let's start with China. Of those four actors from the previous slide, China is probably the furthest along and most capable with respect to its UAV program. They have or are working on a range of platforms for a variety of missions, and while they're not qualitatively or quantitatively where we are, it is a significant program. The Project 2049 Institute released a report a while back that exhaustively documented the architecture of China's UAV program. The report shows that China has extensive design, R&D, and production infrastructure spread across state-run industries and universities. China's program goes back to the 1950s when it reverse engineered some downed Soviet drones, but the program really picked up in the late 90s. The New York Times reported in 2013 that for a 2-year period, hackers linked to the Chinese government had infiltrated foreign defense firms to obtain information on the technology that enabled the U.S. lead in military UAVs. But to be clear, China hasn't just grabbed what it could from the outside. They've invested significantly in creating an indigenous program, and experts say the Chinese are making significant breakthroughs in areas we have historically found rather difficult. So far, in terms of actual deployments, China has deployed UAVs for ISR purposes, which is intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, most notably deploying UAVs to monitor contested maritime territory between China and Japan in the East China Sea. China has also used UAVs at least to demonstrate its counterterrorism capabilities, though they haven't yet deployed for that purpose. Next slide. Now, China's aspirations for its UAV program have caught our government's attention and are raising concern. The U.S.-China Commission report in 2013 took note of China's apparent goals of deploying drones for ISR to enable better targeting by the PLA Navy to target, say, U.S. Navy ships, and also to target ISR targets in Taiwan. The same report took note that China is likely developing UAVs for electronic warfare for the purpose of jamming communications. And China is also working on swarming technology, where swarms of drones could do something like attack an aircraft carrier, with each wave of the swarm responsible for different parts of the attack. So first you have the decoy drones, then you have the electronic warfare drones, and then you have the armed drones. Speaking of armed drones, the DoD in 2013 said China is developing at least 3 armed UAVs. That report, citing the Defense Science Board, commented, quote, "China's move into unmanned systems is alarming and combines unlimited resources with technological awareness," end quote. Next slide. What are the Russians up to? Their UAV program declined after the fall of the Soviet Union, but they've been trying to reestablish it since roughly 2005. Today, it's still not presently thought of as a sophisticated program, or at least what we know of it. Russia often lacks a predictable flow of cash for its defense budgets, and while it has the very old engineers from the Soviet program, as well as the brand new engineers, it lacks the middle management engineers because they left when the funding dropped after the fall of the USSR. Though the program went dark a few years ago, there are indicators that Russia is looking to get back into the UAV game. Next slide. What are they working on? Well, they've infused $9 billion into the development of military UAVs, and they're working on several different kinds of military drones. Interestingly, they're also working on a UAV base about 400 miles off the coast of Alaska to give greater recon capabilities to the Russian Navy in Russia's eastern waters. Analysts have said Russia, though behind the drone curve presently, is on a trajectory to come up with a broad range of sophisticated platforms. I had the chance to interview an individual named Steve Zaloga of the Teal Group a few months ago, and he told me this, quote, "Sooner or later, Russia will come up with a fairly broad range of fairly sophisticated platforms. From the U.S. perspective, yes, there will be concern down the road, though perhaps a little bit slower than concern over China's systems, just because of the relative pace of the programs compared to China. The Russian systems may be, in the end, more sophisticated simply due to the depth of experience in the Russian aerospace industry. The Russians also tend to be very innovative in technology. But at the moment, the fate of the programs is not very well known because of the degree of security the Russians have applied over the past few years." Next slide, please. Iran. The Department of Defense in 2010 stated in a report to Congress that Iran has, quote, "an active program and 2 families of reconnaissance, target, and lethal UAVs," end quote. Subsequent reporting has indicated that Iran has developed several platforms with varying ranges and capabilities, including the Fotros UAV, which, if the specs are accurate, can reach Israel from Iran. Iran's also claimed to have captured, reverse engineered, and reproduced 2 of our drones. The caveat with all this, though, is that Iran often unveils these capabilities in state media. And some have observed that there's a history of pageantry when it comes to Iran's military capabilities, including its UAVs, and that these weapons are often notably low-tech, if not demonstrably fake. Steve Zaloga of the Teal Group had this to say to me, quote, "Short term, the U.S. probably does have a fair amount of concern about Iranian UAV operation and use, and not because they're terribly sophisticated. I would describe it more as a nuisance than a serious threat, but the U.S. military is still concerned. Iranian UAVs will probably grow in complexity and sophistication, especially if Iran is able to tap into a significant exporter. So, for example, if China decides to support Iran by permitting UAV sales, that could bring about a very, very big change," end quote. Next slide. Middle Eastern terrorist groups are benefiting from at least some level of Iranian involvement when it comes to their UAV endeavors. Hezbollah is the most significant actor here. They reportedly have 200 Iranian-made UAVs and have flown UAVs on several occasions into Israeli airspace, including on the outskirts of Haifa. One Hezbollah drone got as close as 20 miles away from Dimona, where Israel is believed to house its nuclear capabilities. Hamas is also involved in UAVs and got one into Israel's airspace from Gaza in 2014. Again, these are not high-tech, sophisticated UAVs in the same league as Israel's or ours. But for these guys, that doesn't matter. These guys want the extra precision that a UAV can provide, not in order to avoid civilian casualties as we seek to do when we deploy UAVs, but rather they want just enough precision to better inflict casualties indiscriminately. And the technology required to build a UAV that can do that is widely available commercially. Lexington Institute's Dan Garay writes, quote, "The airframe for a small drone can be made from cheap materials. They can be powered by battery-driven electric motors found in gardening implements. They need no better guidance system than the GPS that can be found in the average cell phone. But if you want command guidance, you can get a small video camera almost anywhere and route the feed through that same cell phone connected to the local communications network. They can be built in a garage and launched from the driveway," end quote. This has prompted Garay to refer to small drones as the IEDs of the next war. And remember, even if these drones are not strapped with explosives or firing missiles off of them, Hezbollah can use drones to help its usual missile arsenal be more accurate, which is to say deadlier for their purposes. Next slide. What to do about drones getting into the wrong hands? As far as current attempts at curbing proliferation, you see the MTCR and the Wassenaar arrangement up on the screen. You can read some details there. Most important items here are, one, these are voluntary non-binding arrangements. And two, Russia is a member of both of these. China and Iran are. Next slide. Some argue that we need more than non-binding arrangements amongst voluntary members. The UN Arms Trade Treaty, which we've signed but not ratified, purports to govern the transfer of conventional arms. My colleague Ted Bromond over at the Heritage Foundation has observed that pro-ATT advocates are pressing to have drones explicitly included in the ATT. Then there are proposals not so much to regulate proliferation per se, but rather to manage its effects by creating international norms on the acceptable use of drones. The thrust of this argument is that the US has an interest in how others use drones, especially armed ones. Our use of armed drones, particularly away from so-called hot battlefields, is creating a precedent where others feel or will feel that they can do what we do, or at least frame what they do as being no different than what we do. So we need to get in front of this and take the lead on creating norms for acceptable use of drones, so the argument goes. Next slide. Now the problem with proposals to establish international norms, new international norms on drones, is really twofold. One is that this argument assumes that our present use of drones, including away from so-called hot battlefields, violates international law. It does not. We're exercising self-defense, we're in an armed conflict by domestic as well as international law standards, and we're following the rules of necessity and proportionality on the battlefield. The notion that our use of drones renders us incapable of calling out other nations when they violate international law with their armed drones is simply not true. We can use already existing international law on the use of force to determine if countries are violating law when they use these things. We don't need a new regime just for drones. The second problem with the argument that we need new norms is that the parties we are most concerned about would be the least affected by them. There's a real risk that countries or actors that we're most concerned about won't adhere to any such terms. They'll violate them either because A, they don't recognize them in the first place, which is certainly the case with non-state actor types, or B, they'll just find a way to argue that their behavior is actually consistent with those norms. Look at how China manipulates the Law of the Sea Treaty to claim sovereignty over the entire South China Sea. Look at Russia's record of cheating on arms control agreements. Look at what Iran is doing with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. These actors, the ones causing us the most concern, are going to find ways to pursue their interests regardless of what the United States does. So the question is, what is our military doing to bring down the enemy drones it will be facing in real time on the battlefield, norms or no norms? Next slide. Well, first thing they're working on is directed energy, also known as lasers. The idea here is to bring down not only drones, but also missiles and small boats, if this is operated off a ship. The rationale for directed energy is basically to address something called the cost exchange ratio. In a nutshell, it's this. It's relatively cheap for our adversaries to build expendable, unsophisticated stuff, including missiles and drones, and lob them at us. But it's relatively expensive to continue using our own missiles to shoot that stuff down. Here's an example from Israel. Does anyone want to take a guess what the cost of one missile from the Iron Dome system costs once you fire? Yeah, that's a very good guess. The estimates range from between 40 grand at the low end and 100,000 at the high end. That's per missile. Anyone care to take a guess how much it costs for Hamas to fire one of its Grad rockets from Gaza back in 2012? $1,000. $1,000 per missile. So you can see it's very cheap for guys like Hamas to fire their weaponry, it gets very expensive for Israel and perhaps us to keep firing ours to shoot it down. Now, in response to a challenge like this, our Navy is now deploying the laser weapon system, or LAWS, in the Persian Gulf. Reports indicate that the cost of firing a shot from a laser is 59 cents per shot. So talk about an inverted cost exchange ratio. We also have a finite supply of our own missiles, whereas there's less of a supply problem with laser shots as long as you have a power source. We're also working on electronic warfare, which is attacking the enemy's drone's communications link or possibly jamming its radar. And we're also working, interestingly, on drone swarms of our own. Swarms are cheaper than other air defense alternatives to counter enemy drones, and they act as a unit and can communicate with each other. And the folks in the lead on this subject are the guys up at the Navy Postgraduate School. Next slide. Now, enemy drones are not just a problem for our military overseas. They also present homeland security challenges for us and our allies. I'm sure you've seen reports recently that the French authorities are still struggling to figure out who's responsible for a series of drone flights over sensitive sites throughout the country, including nuclear power plants, military installations, and the American Embassy. The New York Police Department has expressed concern recently about the prospect of drone terrorist attacks on the city. And of course, you've probably seen or read about the Secret Service conducting drone exercises in DC recently in order to figure out how to bring them down safely. I'm going to guess that has something to do with the fact that a drone was found on the White House lawn a few weeks ago. Which is all to say that counter-drone tactics need to be part of our homeland defense strategy here, as well as our military strategy abroad. With that, last slide, I'll take any questions. Just hang on for the mic.
There were reports that a U.S. drone was shot down in Syria by the Syrians. How accurate is that, and how'd they do it?
I've seen the reports that you've seen in open sources that it was shot down. I don't know that if our government has yet verified that it was in fact Syrian air defenses. I know that comparatively speaking, the Syrians are thought to have stronger air defense capabilities than some of their neighbors. And look, one of the problems with these Predator, Reaper type drones, as effective as they've been in the counterterrorism space, is that they're incredibly easy to shoot down if you have the air defenses to do it. Al-Qaeda does not have air defenses with which to do this in Waziristan or Yemen. The Syrians, comparatively speaking, probably have better air defenses. So that is one of the reasons why our military has been experimenting with increasingly autonomous UAVs. The idea being that as we face more sophisticated air defenses from, say, the Chinese down the road, we're going to need UAVs in the air that can react with greater speed than perhaps the human mind can tolerate when things are happening at such a high pace and such a high intensity in combat. So that sort of shoot down is an example of why there is an interest in pursuing more autonomous UAVs. But other than what I said, I don't have more information about how they did it. I would imagine it was the Syrian air defenses. Fred?
Ben, I like what you said about the Predator drone that landed in Iran. It's easy for the Iranians to say they reverse engineered this, but the metallurgy and electronics is something that I've always thought was beyond Iran's capabilities. What I was concerned about that is what other nations probably gained from examining that drone. I think the Chinese probably made use of that drone. They had access to one of our best drones while it was in Iran. Have you heard about that kind of thing?
About Chinese access to the drone while it was in Iran? Nothing more than what I've read. I mean, it doesn't surprise me, as you heard me say about what the guy from the Teal Group said, Steve Zaloga. You know, the Chinese could conceivably try to export their UAVs to Iran. There's clearly, you know, a beneficial relationship for both parties there, and so this China-Iran nexus on the UAV program could be a real problem. I don't know how much more China could necessarily have learned from the downed UAV than it's already picked up from having broken into, you know, our servers. But I'm sure it helped. I'm sure it helped to have a downed UAV to actually work with. But as I said, the thing about China is that they have really invested heavily in their own indigenous program. They're not simply stealing from outside. It's quite troubling, actually. Dan?
Address two quick points. First, the whole propaganda value when we send a drone against a country like Syria and it gets shot down is not really surprising if it did happen. It looks like Syria is getting the better of us. I wanted to comment on that whole relative propaganda. And when it comes to intelligence-type drones, can you say a word about the ultra-minimization, which is getting into classified stuff? They apparently are working on super tiny insect-like drones that are virtually unidentifiable, I guess,
Yeah.
by any technological means, I would guess.
So I'll take the second question first. I didn't cover these kinds of drones in the presentation, but drones are increasingly being used by our troops on the ground for tactical recon purposes. They're getting smaller and lighter for that purpose. It's very helpful, for example, for a squad to have a hand-launched drone that they can use to see what's over the other side of that hill. And so you are seeing sort of a, maybe miniaturization is not the right word, but there's a lot of research being done on how drones can do animal mimicry, right? Taking the aerodynamics of flight from various animals, mosquitoes, birds, what have you, and also the resilience of certain animals as well. There's some guys that maybe in California somewhere that are looking at, you know, how it is that a fly can hit a pane of glass and recover so quickly. They want to see if they can get a drone that can, you know, do urban recon, hit a pane of glass, and recover quickly. So there's a lot of interesting research going on in that area, and it's for that tactical ground troop support element of drone use that I didn't quite cover here. And I'm sorry, the first question was?
Propaganda value, we send a drone, we have this high-tech thing, and then Iran says, well, we shot one down. It makes it look like, you know, every time we have one of these reverses, it's a little bit of a black eye. And what is the trade-off? Are policymakers thinking about that when they use these send drones into Syria?
I can't speak for them. I suspect that they're not thinking of it in those terms. I mean, look, my understanding is we've lost fairly few of these things, even against air defenses. So, you know, and when you consider the potential for drones and the way that we're already using them overseas, I mean, look at Islamic State. I commend to you an article that our friend Bill Luty wrote for Defense One recently, talking about the damage that our UAVs are doing, such that they're being deployed to Islamic State on the ground. And if we were to do that on a more regular basis, we could potentially have a greater impact on what's happening on the ground there. So the fact that they shoot one down every once in a while, I'm more concerned about our holding back on the utility of these things, frankly.
Ben, could you, to a point of clarification, I think Fred mentioned a Predator drone going down in Iran. I thought at least one of them was a more stealthy of a vehicle that would not have been as common or as relatively low tech as the Predators are.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct?
So one of them was an RQ-1 Sentinel.
There you go.
And I think it does have more stealthier capabilities than your average Predator.
Which goes to Dan's question about, you know, the propaganda value of having had a stealthy aircraft or UAV shot down.
Sure.
Taken down. In fact, was there not some question as to whether there may have been some interference with the command signal or something that brought it down rather than an air defense, or did that get dispelled?
I'm not sure it got dispelled. I don't believe it was shot down. I think there was some concern that it was brought down by hacking or signal interference or something of that nature. But yeah, I believe it is a more sophisticated drone that they took down than the Predator. But I don't have any more information about the nature of the drone other than that, unfortunately.
Ariel?
I do not recall exactly where, and with the internet, you have to be very careful to filter your sources. But I think I saw a report that the Iranians let the Russians access the stealth drone.
Yeah, I heard that. I heard that too.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds right.
Yeah, everyone's going to be working together on this stuff, right? There's a lot of concern the Chinese will export, but I think the people that we've mentioned up on the slides here are totally open to working with one another on trying to get the UAVs that they want. And remember, I think that if you're going to walk away with one thing from this, they don't have to have exactly what we have for them to be effective, because they're not trying to be as careful as we're trying to be with ours.
Ben, last question, I think. Would you talk a little bit about the challenge of integrating civilian use of these vehicles into our air traffic control system and basically our society.
So the FAA has this process underway. I think it was the 2012 FAA Authorization Act required the FAA to have the national airspace, the NAS, fully integrated for drone use of all sizes, I believe, by 2015. I don't think they're going to make that deadline, and they've said so. But they recently issued their proposed rules for small drone use, which I think is drones that are under 55 pounds and are going to stay below a certain altitude, maybe 400, 500 feet or something like that. So they're working on this. The privacy elements, the privacy concerns about what happens when more of these things get into the air, that has been a prominent part of the debate over airspace integration. It used to be something the FAA was working on. I think, thankfully, the Department of Commerce has taken that over. I don't think privacy is really FAA's purview of expertise on this. But there are concerns. There are concerns, of course, about collision avoidance. There have been some close calls with aircraft hitting drones. There's concerns about drones floating around in places they're not supposed to be, like stadiums and other sporting events. And just yesterday, the House Homeland Security Committee, Scott Perry's subcommittee on oversight and management efficiency, I think, had a hearing on domestic drones and sort of the criminal and terrorist threat that they pose to folks here. And there were folks testifying from law enforcement saying that this is a serious problem, and there needs to be more cooperation with the state governments and federal governments, state law enforcement, federal law enforcement, for the local authorities to better understand what to do if they see a drone that is acting illegally or that may be used for some kind of attack. There's a lot of concern from the law enforcement community. I don't think it's anything that can't be overcome, but this is technology that's available everywhere. It can be used for a lot of good, but it can also certainly be used for a lot of ill purposes as well.
Good, Ben, thank you very much. Great presentation, and thanks for all the work you're doing behind it.